university environment into the startup scene. Recently I moved to Spain. Now I'm living in Barcelona and working at the UPC. So where I'm setting up a new lab for accelerated discovery of new energy materials. So that's a little bit about my background. And during the next 30 minutes, me and Jared will try to discuss different aspects of this difficult transition from hardcore research into startup and beyond. Because it's not always so straightforward, and there are many different pitfalls or challenges that startups in this situation may face. So maybe first, Jared, can you tell us a little bit more about your institute? Because you're located in the US, and maybe you can tell a little bit about the vision and concept of your institute.
Yeah, happy to share. So our institute is based in Montana, which is not known as a startup ecosystem, but we work with folks from around the world. And in particular, we have 3 different areas of focus. It's science education, where we work with students, kindergarten through 12th grade. We do science communication, where we form partnerships with groups like Scientific American and other well-known science publications. And then I lead our science innovation work. And in particular, what we're interested in is finding really interesting technology, so technology that maybe someone like Casper would discover, and then providing them the funding and the networks and the training needed to take that from lab scale to pilot scale and beyond. So that's a little bit about what we do, but why do we do that? So biomimicry, just to quickly explain, it's a funny word. Bio means life. Mimicry, it means to mimic something, to copy something. So how can we mimic life? We like to say that a sustainable world exists all around us. When a leaf falls from a tree, it doesn't sit in a landfill for 10,000 years waiting to decompose. It decomposes within several months. So how can we create materials and chemistry and processes that mimic nature and emulate nature? It's much harder to do than it sounds, but we have now tools and technologies and processes like Casper's inventing to help us accomplish that. So yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about a typical journey? I mean, how does it work? What is it? Can you maybe give some examples of a journey of a research, maybe coming out of university that is transitioning down this path?
Absolutely, and this one has a connection to Spain as well. So there's a company called eConcrete that is a spin out from Israel, a university in Israel, and it was started by 2 marine biologists, and these marine biologists saw on one of their dives that human-made coastal infrastructure, if you think about the last time you went to a port, it's all gray concrete that's dead. Nothing is living there, which is abnormal. In the ocean, when there's rocks that meet the water, that's usually attracts life. So these marine biologists ask themselves, why is that happening? They started to realize that how concrete has been formulated is actually toxic to life, and it doesn't have the cracks and crevices to attract life. So they created a new company, a new concrete company that is now scaling up around the world. They're a lead at the Port of Vigo with the new Living Ports initiative. They scaled up and are doing work on the Trans-Adriatic pipeline. And I like to share this example because infrastructure is incredibly hard to scale. It took them 15 years to go from idea to this level. And now they have 75 employees and they're growing like crazy. And I think some important lessons to take from that as we talk about scale is what does it take to get to that point? So one of those things is patient capital. They relied on a lot of government grants as well as a lot of impact-based angels to help get them to that point where they're ready to do pilots. The other aspect that was critically important was regulation. They actually, because of their research as marine biologists, their research was written into code in the EU. So not only are they the ones who have created these new standards, now they have the company that can meet those standards. And I think that's something we're seeing time and time again, especially in the EU, is regulation is actually helping some of these deep tech companies to scale.
And now to put the biomimicry aspect to it, what is in this case, what is the added value of biomimicry? Why does it make sense here?
Yeah, so that makes sense because typically coastal infrastructure needs to be repaired every 15 or 20 years. Because this attracts life and life grows on it, it calcifies. So think of a coral reef as it grows. It actually gets stronger over time, completely eliminating the need for maintenance or drastically reducing it. So it's a little bit more of a cost up front, but in the long run, it's a huge return on investment.
Well, that's a very cool example of inspiration from nature creates actually a more sustainable and strong product. Can you give other examples of biomimicry startups or concepts that are coming out of your institute that you're working with?
Yeah, I would be happy to. One that I love to share is a university spin-out from the University of Cambridge, and they were studying these brilliant white beetles. So they're called white Staphylococcus beetles, and what they were asking themselves is, well, how does this beetle accomplish this white color? Because our human-built environment, like these white chairs or your toothpaste or other things that are colored white, are typically dyed with titanium dioxide. So there's this mineral called titanium dioxide, that actually is really efficient at scattering light. To get that titanium dioxide, we have to create giant titanium mines. And this is a $12 billion industry. So this is a massive, massive industry. Nature doesn't mine titanium. Nature creates color usually through structure. And what they saw through this beetle is that the structure of its hair diffused light in a very efficient manner. And they've created an analog made out of cellulose that does the exact same thing. This is another great example of university research, years under development, that all of a sudden found a really interesting need and niche, and then with the right regulation has been able to scale. The EU recently listed titanium dioxide as a carcinogen, so it is now being banned from pharmaceutical and food products. So there's kind of the market-driven force that's needed to scale.
So now maybe we could transition a little bit and talk about what needs to be in place to make this transition. I mean, it's very easy to focus on money, of course, investments or financing, but I would argue that there are many other factors that are equally important that a sort of innovation ecosystem need to have. What is, from your perspective, what are the important factors, and what do you think? How are you thinking about that?
Absolutely, and I'll answer it from the perspective we see in the US, and then I'd love for you to answer that from your perspective as well. I think there's a couple things. First, a lot of these initiatives are based on tens of years of scientific research. So there's already millions of dollars of research and development put into these companies at a university level, at a fundamental research level. So we need things like the Horizon grants, or in the US, NSF or Department of Energy grants to fund this fundamental research. I think then the next step is founder-friendly policies to help this intellectual property leave the university. Where I graduated, it's not necessarily the most founder-friendly place. It might take 2 years to license the intellectual property, which would crush most startups. But I think Casper's University is the opposite.
Yes, so I think it depends a lot on where you are, and I've got a lot of my training in the Swedish system. That is, Sweden and China have a different way of thinking about this. They decided that all the IP belongs to the researchers, and therefore there are no discussions about who owns the IP. It's the researchers who owns the IP, and this lowers the barrier for transitioning from university research into startup, because there's no IP discussions, it's already owned. But the university did a lot of extra policies to facilitate this, because we are talking about deep tech startups here, companies who maybe need a wet lab, maybe they need a cell lab or chemistry lab or materials production lab or an analysis. And their university was quite forward thinking and have created a way for the startup companies to rent the labs that maybe they already come out of. So they know the whole infrastructure, they have access to all the same machines, and it costs nothing for university because the machines are not used in the evening or the weekends. So they rent out the machines that are standing there anyways. So it's basically a win-win situation, and it lowers the barrier tremendously. And the three startups that are currently active from my group, that has all been founded in the last years, are all based on that. So they're started without any investment, 100% owned by the founders. So they don't need to go and beg for money and spend 2 years on raising capital. They can just transition from a research environment to a startup environment to a freestanding company. And from the unit of about 100 researchers that I was heading at Chalmers, maybe we have founded 30 companies in the last 10 years, and the most valuable are worth more than €1 billion today. It's actually a biomimicry research company that is making printed organs with live cells inside. So they are making the inks and the printers to make artificial nose or ear or other parts of your body, and with live cells inside. And they're the leading 3D bioprinting company in the world today. And this was started just by a PhD student and some business people, and they could do this without even having any discussion with the university, because there was a policy in place about the ownership of IP. It belonged to the company. They could rent the lab, and they could just scale up like that. So they could grow very, very fast without having to go out with the hat in their hand. So I think this is a unique thing to Sweden, but I think it could be emulated different aspects of this at other institutions. I think that there is a misconception in a lot of the university world that scientists are going to get some kind of great idea, and then the big industry that have infinite money will come and buy that idea and shower the whole university with funding, and then take the idea and commercialize it. This is not how the world works. Often if you are in a deep tech situation, there are many years and many uncertainties at this stage, maybe 10 years of development before that idea or this materials concept is ready to be deployed for anything. And therefore, at the time where it's leaving the research phase, there's not so much value in it. And so actually, I think the universities have to understand that often at the stage where they think some technology is ready to spin out, the value is actually quite low. A lot of the value creation is happening in the startups in the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years. And then it can be valuable. But it's a long journey where the university maybe more should see themselves as a facilitator or a supporter to make that journey possible at all. And I think that at some places there has to be a change in mindset there, because it's only when this journey has been made to the end that you're really making a change in the world. And that's when you really, it's not just about money, it's also about seeing the world change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you mentioned a couple interesting things. So we were talking about what are some of those interventions needed to help scale these solutions. So I think it starts all the way from the beginning. So robust funding in fundamental science, and then an encouraging and kind of policy-led environment to support that fundamental research to spin out. And then what you mentioned, it's very different in the US. The university owns the intellectual property, and you typically don't have any rights to use laboratories. Because that's government funded, it can't be used for for-profit initiatives, typically. So that's one of the big expenses. So a biotech company we supported, for example, recently raised $3 million in funds. They probably spent $1 million of those dollars to build out a lab, to buy the necessary equipment, and to staff up appropriately. Whereas at Chalmers, they wouldn't have had to do that. So that lowers the amount of investment capital needed, which I think is really great for markets that maybe don't have as robust of a VC scene as the US.
And that was a little bit why I wanted to start the discussion, is that one thing is money, and maybe a lot of people are running around with their startup and chasing money, but there is actually a lot of other factors when we're talking about these science-based startups that are equally, if not even more important. And that is, I mean, a startup cannot buy a whole chemistry lab or a whole analytical lab. I mean, so
how much does your chemistry lab cost?
Yeah, my chemistry lab is very expensive. I mean, if you just take the lab itself, maybe it costs, let's say, between 1 and 2 million euros. But that's not all. Then you have all the analytical infrastructure of the university. So you cannot copy that. So if you want this to happen, university have to create a platform where they can nurture this, and there can be mutual benefits. I think this is many places realize that. I just think as a startup, you have to decide where you place yourself and what ecosystem you place yourself in, and also a lot of universities here, they know this. So there are science parks that are located next to the universities or at the universities, so that the companies, the small companies, can benefit from these close relations, and that creates some small bubbles of success of startups coming out of the university ecosystems like that.
Absolutely. Can I keep adding on to that question? So I think once you get past, okay, so you're at that stage, you spun out of the university, you're still kind of in lab stage. So typically we're talking about, like, maybe you can produce 1 kilogram of product, but to sell it on the market, you need to sell 20 tons of this. So that's a big difference. It's a big process difference to get there. Yeah. So I think another thing that's needed to help scale these solutions are friendly pilots with companies. And if I could share an example, and then I would love to hear your take. So one of the companies we supported is a Chicago-based company that turns construction debris into reusable construction materials, and it does this through mycelium, through fungi. So it will break down asphalt shingles or drywall, and that can be converted then into new insulation products. So it creates a fully circular construction industry. They had one of their first pilots was with Meta, with Facebook, the parent company of Facebook. And what was really interesting is you don't think about Facebook as a building company or Meta as a building company, but I think they're building a new data center every week or something like that. It's an incredible growth, and with that comes a lot of construction debris. So they wanted to see how can we improve upon our sustainability practices by mitigating that construction debris. So I think what we're seeing is another step to scale is find friendly companies that are looking to mitigate some environmental issues. And again, our take is on the environmental sustainability lens, but there are not enough solutions to meet all of the big corporate sustainability needs at the moment. So there's a huge value proposition for companies like this to come in and fill the gap. Now that they've proven that, they have this opportunity to scale not only with Meta, but now with all of these other data centers that are being built all around the world. So I think that's a very tangible pilot opportunity with companies. And that doesn't even get into scaling technology. So that's kind of then the next step is then how do you scale this technology?
And maybe I can add into that a little bit from some of the research I'm doing in my research group is that I have seen that many times you can make some kind of wonderful molecule or material in a lab, in a chemistry lab, but then you come to the scale up, it's going to be a huge hurdle. So we're actually trying to change how we are doing research in the lab. We're working directly with new concepts called like flow chemistry, where typically when you make chemistry today, you have some kind of reactor and you pour things together and you cook, and then next someone come and ask for that kilogram or the 10 kilogram, and then you have to buy a bigger reactor and a bigger reactor, and every time you have to optimize everything again. And the traditional way in pharmacy industry is that, when it gets really big, we go to India because they have the biggest factories for chemicals. But there is another way that is emerging, and that is involving the small pipes and hoses where you pump the things together, and then you have some kind of a automated micro production facility that you can use to make small amounts of molecules, but you can also run it day in and day out and produce what you want on larger scale. And this have both the advantages for the scale up, but also it's a way to digitalize the chemistry, because before it was a chemist pulling things together, now it's a robot pumping things together. This means that you can go from doing one experiment per day to do 100 experiments per day. But that's not all. You also have a mini factory that is self-operating, and that you can use to produce 1,000 kilos per year on a footprint like this. So you don't need the offshore chemical plant in India. You can actually produce what you need locally, and you can just download the recipe and start producing. And that is basically two of the startups in my team, from my company. One is producing catalyst for CO2 conversion, and we're the only ones in the world that can make this high quality catalyst. Many places can make it on milligram scale, but we can sell you 100 grams of special shaped gold because of this type of production. A question here?
Thank you very much for this discussion, and for me it's something that I'm really interested in, because I'm from Cambridge, UK, and I do a lot of work with the University of Cambridge. And what you talked about, taking science from academia and taking into the industry as a startup, and the challenges that you've mentioned, the IP and everything, it's something that is very close to my heart. Just as we've got only a few minutes to finish this discussion, but I thought it would be an important thing to talk about. In terms of the scaling, right, and this transition outside of academia, what do you do to also support founders that have a deep technical knowledge and expertise, and suddenly they have to pitch to organizations, they have to translate hard science in the way that investors can hear? So if you can have a very quick advice on that, because I think that would be very key for anybody that's listening that might want to get in touch with you as well.
I'm so glad you asked that. That's a core part of our program. So our accelerator, we don't typically focus on the traditional things accelerators focus on. Like traditional accelerators are how do you build your sales pipeline, or how do you work on your finances and build your cap table. One of the key elements we focus on is science communication. And we think that's important for many reasons. You're not going to be able to, typically these founders are the expert. There might be 5 people in the world who are smarter than them, but typically they are the expert in their field. You're never going to get an investor that knows everything about what you're doing. You're never going to get a customer that knows everything about what you're doing. So you have to find ways to connect, and that's where we think biomimicry and nature is really powerful. So to share an example, we recently took groups to California where we have the giant redwood trees. These trees might be at 100 meters, 200 meters tall. And somehow they get water from their roots up to the top of the tree. So there you're starting to visualize, that's water transportation. That's incredibly hard to do for humans. It's incredibly hard to pump water that far. And now we can start to get into some of the science. Okay, so we're moving water, that's really hard. How do we do that? And then we can start to explain all the different forces involved. And I think it's starting to draw some visuals and comparisons while being accurate and true. You're trying to educate someone along the way. I think that's how you do it. You draw comparisons. You remember that your job is to be a teacher and to educate. And then the most important thing is you share it. Often people, especially technical people, keep that to themselves. You also have to be comfortable getting out there and sharing it with folks.
I can add in. I think it's a very good question, because it's not always the same person who is the chemical engineer that's also the startup guy or girl. But so often it's also about making the connections to entrepreneurs, or creating teams that together have maybe the set of skills needed to do this journey. So there's, at least in Sweden where I've worked most, we have a lot of networking events, a close collaboration with the incubator, the university incubator, the entrepreneur school, the scientists coming together and creating teams like that. So often it's not a one-person team. It's a combination of 2, 3, 4 people making the startup journey together.
Thank you very much.